Hello and welcome back to Module 6. In this module, we'll talk about GDPR and outbound sales. So obviously, GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. And even though it's B2B sales, it actually applies. And when you will be an SDR, the GDPR will have an important part in your process because we are actually working with personal data of many different people, and there is some regulation around that. So please, in this module, there is nothing about creativity or whatever. It's like very technical. So and it's actually including some legal terms and definitions. So make sure you are kind of fully concentrated before we start. Let's get started. So again, we have talked about this before. What is outbound, inbound, and so on. And in this module, I'm only going to talk about GDPR for outbound. And if you want to read, and I actually recommend you read the full Article 14. If you are motivated, you can even read the full GDPR. I have done it myself. But then when it comes to inbound, so when the potential prospect or customers are signing up on the website or signing up for the trial or sending you an email or whatsoever, it's a different article that actually covers this part of the process. It's the Article 14, and we are not going to talk about this one in the training because simply as an SDR, this part will not be our problem. It will be the marketing team to ensure that whatever lead generation, lead capturing form, whatever they have on the website is actually GDPR compliant. But when it comes to doing the cold outbound outreach, this is going to be your job to make sure that you follow the GDPR regulation and you follow the Article 14. So looking at this funnel from that perspective, again, from the other part of the process, this is where the GDPR will apply in all the process. So obviously, every time we process on CRM, we process data in the CRM or we update the CRM, when we define our ideal customer profile, and we'll go through it later, then obviously this part is all the part when we process the personal data in the CRM. And then as soon as we do the outreach, it's also very, very, very important to make sure that all those parts are compliant with the GDPR. A few definitions and terms that we're going to use in this module. So personal data, it actually include like anything like full name, job title, email, personal phone number, and so on and so forth. Even if it's a professional email, it is personal data. Processing means that anytime you are kind of putting data in your CRM on the spreadsheets whatsoever, you are processing data. Controller is going to be the company you work for. They will be called controller. Processor are the tools that you use. So for example, if you use Google Docs or if you use a CRM to process the data, the tools are processor. The data subject is your prospect. So your leads are data subject. The consent is that they basically they have freely given you and they are fully aware that you're processing their data and what is the purpose. And of course, when we put them in our CRM, put prospects in our CRM because we found them on LinkedIn and so on and so forth, they definitely did not give us any consent and they are not aware of it. Direct marketing is the term that is used once in the full GDPR, which basically means cold sales. And then the data protection officer is also called DPO, is the person in the company that is in charge of making sure that the data is the personal data or whatever data processes are kind of compliant with GDPR. And the first question we always get in the top 5 questions related to GDPR and sales is, do I need to get the consent to do the cold outreach? And the answer is no. And it is not that straightforward, but there is basically a recital. Recitals are kind of bullet points at the beginning with numbers at the beginning of the legal text. And the number 47 basically says that you can process personal data for direct marketing, so for cold outreach, if you have, or it might be regarded as a legitimate interest, if it's a legitimate interest. So meaning that you can contact someone if you have a legit reason to do so. But again, the key part here is may. meaning that it is not by default that, oh, I think I have a legit reason to contact them, right? Because within the same recital, they basically tell you that you need to be careful with how you assess your legitimate interest, and basically anyone can challenge it at some point. Which is why, and we'll go through this, it's very important to have a very neat process when it comes to processing data and the GDPR compliance part. And then does data subject have rights when you process their data? And the answer is yes, even if it's direct marketing purpose. So according to the Article 15, they have the right of access to the data. So basically, they can simply ask you, please give me all the data you have on me, and you have to respect their rights. So meaning you need to send by email, and the term is a machine readable format. So a CSV spreadsheet type of file. They have the right to rectify the data. So I'm pretty sure with outbound sales, it's very, very, very unlikely that's going to happen. But for example, if someone gets a new job title, or if someone gets married and get a new name, they can basically contact you and tell you, please update my data in your CRM. Again, very unlikely this is going to happen in B2B sales, but they have this right. They have the right to erasure, so basically right to be forgotten, meaning that you need to remove them from your CRM and whatever other tools where you have their personal data. They have the right to restrict the process of the data. So this one means if they basically challenge your legitimate interest and say, actually, no, you have no legitimate interest whatsoever to contact me. Now I want you to basically restrict the data and until we have some legal authority to review if you have a true legitimate interest and whatsoever. So if some data subject exerts this right, you might be in trouble. And then, of course, they have to be notified every time they are asking for erasure of restricting the process and so on and so forth, right? They have the right to object. So basically, GDPR or not, I mean, we were following this one. They have the right to say that they are not interested, and you need to respect that. So, I mean, again, this is here pure common sense. You just don't want to piss off people. So if someone is telling you they are not interested, you just confirm that you will not contact them again, right? And then do you need to inform them about their rights when you process data for direct marketing purpose? And the answer is yes. So the first, and kind of also be ready here because there is 3 slides of the rights that they have. So the first part is you need to inform them about the identity of the controller. The easy way to do this is basically to add the company details, the full company details within your email signature. Then you need to, if applicable, so if you cannot have point A, you need to basically have the point B, so the data protection officer contact details. The purpose of why you are processing their data, so most of the time the purpose for us, actually, not most of the time, all the time is going to be direct marketing. What is the legitimate interest? So it's actually the same because our purpose is the legitimate interest, so it's for direct marketing. The category of the personal data concerned. So here the category concern the full name, the email, and the job title, stuff like this, right? So this is basically what we have in terms of category of personal data. This one is a bit tricky and you will need to explain the rule for it, but you need to explain what, from what period and what is, if not applicable, then what is the criteria to use for how long you're going to keep their data in the CRM. So you also need to explain that to them. Then, of course, you need to tell them that they have the right to basically request the data, they can rectify it, and so on and so forth. You have to tell them that they have the right to lodge a complaint. You have to tell them from which source you got their personal data, if it was publicly accessible. And then finally, you need to tell them all these rights in the first touch point. So the first time you talk, you are basically reaching out to them. And here it's basically a recital again. So one of the bullet points at the beginning of this legal document that kind of sums up many of the previous points, right? But it's also related to these questions. So obviously we will go through how do we solve this type of challenge, and we have to have a disclaimer template that we put at the bottom of the emails. But these are everything you need to tell to your prospect, to the data subject when you do the first outreach, if they are in Europe, right? And do I need to document my internal process to apply the GDPR? Yes, of course you need to do this, and it's very, very, very important to document your legitimate interest. So obviously, when we do the ICP, when we do the ideal customer profile, this is our legitimate interest, and this is what we will use to say, look, your company actually looks exactly like our ideal customer profile, our existing customers, and that's why we have a legitimate interest to contact you. Then we will have dedicated fields in the CRM to kind of document our legitimate interest. Will you do this anyway, GDPR or not? But this will kind of give us even more legitimate interest to prove that we need to contact this company because they have this and this and that that actually match our ICP. Then the personal data processing, we of course need to collect from which source we got what personal data, and we need to ensure that we have a process to record and honor the data subject request. And then, of course, if you can flowcharts everything, it's obviously even more transparent on how and why you respect the GDPR. And then, of course, as we just said with the process, so you need to have a place where you record the request made by the data subject and have a clear and transparent process to inform them. So transparent is actually something that comes back a lot in the GDPR legislation. So it's very, very important that whatever process you implement in your company, they are actually very transparent. And then we have templates to honor the data subject request, so it's much more easier and much more systematic on how we deal with this type of issues. And a very, very common question as well that we get is, even if the company you work for or with is not based in the EU, the GDPR still apply because you process personal data of EU subjects. So you can be a US company. If the data subject, if the prospect are in the EU, the GDPR still applies to you. And this is kind of the region that they basically describe. So if your organization is located in a place where the EU law applies by virtue of the public international law. So basically, maybe if you are based in North Korea or Iran, the GDPR might not apply, but unless you are in some other countries, the GDPR will probably apply. And now when it comes to outbound and GDPR, there is basically three key parts. You have the data processing part, the outreach, and then you have the part where you honor the data subject request. So we'll go through these three parts one by one. So the first part, again, now we look at how the CRM is set up for the data processing, right? So we have seen this before. These are the typical fields you get on the different object. Actually, in this example, you see it's company, people, and deals, so it's a bit different than Salesforce, but it's exactly the same objects. So we have the ICP and ICP type as custom fields here. Then we have the email, the stage, the full name, the job title, the expertise and type and GDPR source that are here. These are default fields. These are fields within our process that will actually be used a bit later as well as a documentation of the legitimate interest. And this is a new field that is dedicated specifically to GDPR. And again, what is important is the flowchart that we use for the pre-qualification for the enrichment needs to be updated and needs to be this documentation can be used to make sure that we respect to show that we have a process to check our legitimate interest, even though here our legitimate interest is basically already part of the process. It's actually this part. If the company is ICP, then we will look for personal data of the subject that we want to contact, right? So it doesn't know the link to the GDPR is not direct because here we are just processing the data of again companies, but yeah, it's directly linked to your legitimate interest. Then when we do the lead enrichment, this is where the first GDPR part kind of comes into play, right? So where did we get the data that we process? And then obviously also here we need to have a new status. We already have it, but I mean, if you don't have it already, to make sure that it is do not contact related to GDPR. So it's even more strict than not interested. If someone told you to not contact them again, don't ever try to kind of update, oh, you were not interested because of this or that. It's a full stop, do not contact. It's like unsubscribe. And then expertise and type will be used it's already used for us as a way to kind of systemize and report on what are the best type of people we get reply from and so on and so forth. But this is also used here to kind of, again, legitimate even document even further or legitimate interest to process the data, because these people actually have the same expertise of our existing clients and the same type of decision making job title or influencer job title as a type. And then, of course, the GDPR source are what we'll describe in the next steps. So this is what we will use part of our disclaimer. And there is just some scenarios, right, that we have systemized. So basically, whenever you find or add the information about this person in the CRM, you need to pick one of the scenarios. So you have find their information in the LinkedIn profile, full name and job title, and the email address was guessed based on email structure, which was publicly available, or everything was on the website, part of it was on the website, and so on and so forth, right? And then you have other scenarios where you get the information from out of office reply, someone was CC'd to the email. So basically, every single person that you add to the CRM needs to have the GDPR data collection source. So these are only for inbound, but outbound. But then, of course, if you do it as well for inbound, automatically your inbound team needs to kind of have there's different scenarios of where and what data you got and from where, right? So for the outbound, these are some of the main scenarios we have identified. And then as soon as you find another scenario that is systematic, you can just add a new entry to the custom field in your CRM to make sure it is actually included. And the link to the GDPR here is super direct because you are basically processing personal data here. And it's very, very important that you make some of these fields mandatory. So for example, this field right here, so the one that is here, has to be a mandatory field. So you cannot add people in the CRM without choosing one of the scenario in this field. Very, very important. And then for the outreach, so we need to inform the subject, right? So if you go back to the previous article in the in the previous slides, in the point B of article 14.3, then you need to inform them about, these 3 slides. So the solution we have is basically to have this disclaimer. So as you can see here, we include in the email signature the address and details of the company. And then we basically tell them that following the GDPR, you are hereby informed that your personal data was found on your, and here basically the field from the CRM is coming, on your LinkedIn profile, full name and job title, and so on and so forth. And you tell them the purpose of why you and which legitimate interest you use. So your personal data was manually processed in our CRM for direct marketing purpose. And you don't have to do, according to the GDPR, you have the right to lodge a complaint to a supervisory authority. So you inform them about this right. You don't have to say this, but it's just to kind of educate. However, direct marketing purpose may be regarded as a legitimate interest, which doesn't require the consent of the data subject. And then you inform them that their personal data is stored in our CRM and will not be processed for any other purpose for direct marketing. So then here you tell them what is the rule and why you keep the data in their CRM. And then you basically tell them that they have the following rights. So to object, to request data, or to request full erasure, and to object or express a request, they simply need to set the number of the request they want to basically use. Basically, as simple as this, to express their request. And people actually reply to email with 1 or 3 and so on and so forth. And the pros of this approach is actually super simple for the data subject to express their right. And the this format also simplifies the steps for the processor. But then, of course, it's not the sexiest type of disclaimer you can have at the bottom of your email. Some other company will prefer to have a link to a form where you have exactly all the same, and then you need to select what you want in terms of, steps. But then the cons of this approach is that it creates extra steps for the data subject, but then it also creates extra steps for the company, because then they need to track everything in a separate document, make sure it is actually followed by or owned by someone, and that the data that you also add in that document is adding another personal data point. Like, for example, they will need to put their email here and express their right. So you will need to have, if they say that they want full erasure, you will need to delete their email from the CRM and then delete their email from this form, whatever response. So it's kind of creating double duplicate data to remove, right? But then again, it's lower text at the bottom of your email, and you might be able to automate stuff like this if you have the capacity internally. I mean, automate the erasure or whatever. And then, of course, very often we get asked, like, so what do we do about cold call? So to be honest, it's a very tricky part because you will need to actually, like, according to the GDPR, you will need to say this full disclaimer at the beginning of, like, in the first touch point of your sales. So it might sound weird, but usually we'll need to actually say all this before to even say anything else to the person you're outreaching. So theoretically, I don't think anyone will challenge you, but this is the legislation that you have now in Europe. So the easy way to, if you want to do cold call, would be to have the first touch point as an email. So then it's actually recorded and transparent that in your first touch point you verify the GDPR, and then in your second touch point, which is a call, you don't need to basically inform them about all the GDPR because you already did it in your email. And then the last part, of course, is honoring the data subject request. So you need to do this, and you need to actually do this in as fast as possible. That's what they mean by without undue delay at the last, and the latest within 1 month. So usually you can do it within a few hours. And the recommended solution is to have internal systems. So basically, here's the data subject. So your prospect, this is you, your company, the controller. You get a request. You check if it's one of these requests. Then according to this, you follow the process to update your CRM. And you confirm using the templates. And if you don't get any other requests, you finish. If so, then you go back here. And very simple. If they request to basically object the processing, it means like full stop, not interested. You basically tell them that's per your request. I confirm that blah, blah, blah. CRM was updated and you will not be contacted anymore. If they want the data, you basically extract the data and send it to them. And if they want their data to be removed, you basically confirm that you have removed the data. Now there is basically a loophole with that system, because if I remove the data of someone from my CRM, but the company was still ICP, and I have this recycling process going on to make sure that any company that in my CRM was not touched for more than whatever 6 to 9 months will be automatically recycled with a new contact, I might add again this contact because this person was not in my CRM anymore. And in a way, this will be GDPR compliant because this is a loophole in the system. But the way we found to basically make sure that this doesn't happen again is this simple process. So this is the mailbox, this is the company in the CRM, and this is the contact in the CRM. And every time you get a removal request of personal data, you have 2 new fields on your CRM. You have personal data removal request, where you put yes. So then you know that in this company, someone have asked for their data to be removed. And then it's okay to keep anonymous data. So what is anonymous is a job title. So we could actually put CTO. So here, yes, and CTO. So then by default, we know that in this company, a CTO have request to remove their personal data from our CRM. So we can make sure that if we ever decide to re-enrich this company, we definitely do not add a CTO. And then if possible, you can add what is the start date of their CTO role from LinkedIn to make sure that we also, if we ever decide to add a new CTO because we think there is a new one, we double check that the start date of this person is different from the CTO comma date data point that we have is in the CRM, which is anonymous data, obviously. Then, of course, we remove the contact and we confirm that the erasure was done. So this is kind of the workaround we have to make sure, even though this might be compliant, the goal in B2B sales is not to reach out to people just to piss them off, right? And we have, if you actually want to be more knowledgeable about the GDPR for B2B outbound, again, within the slides that are shared already with you, you can download a full e-guide and go through the full process. And if you ever have some questions or you're not sure or you look for something specific in the GDPR, I highly recommend that you use this link, which is a very easy way and much more user experience friendly way to search GDPR text and PDF. So to conclude on the GDPR, it's quite simple. The main idea is that even though you have a legitimate interest, this is definitely not some kind of get out of jail for free card that you can always raise anytime you have issues, right? It's very, very, very important to make sure that you document and you truly have a legit reason to contact people and to process the data of people you want to contact. So thank you for your attention. Now you will have some questions about the GDPR, and I'll see you in the last module of the SDR training.